Welcome back. Now that you have learned the basics of Dart, it's time to build our very first application. Let's go. Now this program is going to be very simple. We're just going to capture some information from the command line and use that information to execute various functions. Trust me, this program is going to be highly valuable. Now, you might be asking yourself, how are we going to capture data from the command line? Well, first of all, you need to understand what a library is. If you've never programmed before, a library is just a pre-configured set of tools and utilities that you can use without having to write the software yourself. And it happens that Dart actually includes a lot of libraries that you can use, one of which we're going to take advantage of today. This is going to be called the IO library. To import a library in Dart, you're going to type the import keyword, and then inside of single quotes, you're going to type out Dart IO, and then you're going to close the statement with the semicolon. So you'll notice this is underlined. Don't worry about this error. All it's saying is the library is not in use yet since we haven't written our code. Now that this library is created, we're actually going to go into our main function. Now, since we don't have it yet, we do need to create it. Remember, you're actually going to create the main function as void almost always. So now we've created void main. Now inside of void main is where we're going to start accessing this code from the IO library we previously imported. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a function that comes with it called standardin.readLineSync. All that means is it's going to ask you for input on the command line. So what does this readLineSync function do? Well, it simply allows you to take data from the command line and input it into your application and use it for something. But you might remember earlier we talked about variables. If you don't have something stored in a variable, you can't really use it somewhere else. So we actually have to assign a variable to this readLineSync code. So we're actually going to capture a string. So we're going to define a string. Remember, Dart is an optionally typed language, but since we know the data type, we are going to use a string, and we're going to call it description. So I don't want you to worry about this error message too much right now. But if you look at the standardin.readLineSync line, it's telling you that there's an error. And basically what it's saying is that this can be null. Without going into it too much now, since this is a beginner lesson, Dart is a null-safe programming language. Basically, this means that if you want a variable to be null, you have to define it as such. Otherwise, null is a prohibited value. So in order to make this error go away, we are going to put a question mark at the end of the string statement, which is going to allow this variable to be null. This needs to be done because technically when you're getting input from the command line, the user has the option to leave this blank. So we just need to make sure that null is an accepted value. Again, don't worry much about this for now. Before we run our application, we're going to do one more thing. We're going to add a print statement, and we're going to print out the variable description. This is going to allow us to see what we just typed in, just to make sure it's working. So let's go ahead and run this application. Okay, so you can see this application started. Now all we have here is a cursor. That's because we haven't added any other text. But watch this. We can type in, let's type in pizza. And if you'll notice, we type in pizza, we hit enter, and then the command line spits back to us pizza. So we can see that our application isn't working. But I'm sure you, like me, can see a very intense flaw in this application. The user isn't being prompted for anything. So let's go ahead and tell the user what to input. Now we're going to use a different library that came with this Dart IO function called standardout. Now, as you might guess, standardout just means output, where standardin means input. So we're going to do standardout.write. And then we're going to type a message here. What type of input should we get? I feel like I'm not getting enough compliments these days, so let's go ahead and ask for, type in a compliment about Jeffrey Booth. And then we're going to end that with a colon. Let's run this application again and see if it functions better. Type in a compliment about Jeffrey Booth. This makes a lot more sense. Let's type in he is not that ugly. Now it just types out not that ugly. Okay, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So what we're going to do, we're going to go to the print statement, and we're going to add some double quotes here. And we're going to type in Jeffrey Booth is, and then we're going to put a space. Now, between the string statement where we just typed out Jeffrey Booth and our description variable, we're going to add a plus. You might be wondering what this is. It's called concatenation. And in software, concatenation is merely combining two pieces of data together, often used with strings, but it can be applied to other data types as well. Now you're going to notice we have another error here, and it's talking about the parameter type string question mark can't be applied to string. Well, this is merely because we assigned that null safe operator earlier. We're going to put an exclamation point after the description variable to make that error go away. This is basically just saying we're going to allow a null value so it matches up with the string we created earlier. So let's try this again. We're going to run this application. If you aren't familiar with the command line yet, you can just hit the up arrow to re-execute a previous command. This will save you some time over the long run. So we're going to hit enter. So we're going to type in a compliment. Jeffrey Booth is kind of good looking a little bit. And we're going to see we get the proper desired output there. Jeffrey Booth is kind of good looking a little bit. Now I'm sure that you can see some errors in this application. What happens if we, for instance, hit enter and don't enter any input? It just says Jeffrey Booth is with no following statement. That doesn't make any sense. We have to fix this bug, stat. So we're going to use a few logical and conditional statements to actually do something with this data. That's the heart of what programming is, simple logical statements. So the bare bones statement that you're going to use in literally every application you write is called the if statement. It's super simple. You would communicate this idea in English by saying, if Jeffrey has an apple, then put apple to mouth and chew. So we're going to create our if statement here. Now you'll notice we have a variable here called description. So what we really need to do is check and see if that description is empty or not. Does it have data or is it empty? So we're going to type out description. Now, description is created with the Dart string type. Anytime you use the description type in Dart, there's all these methods you can use that are built in. Dart has a very handy method built in called isEmpty. And all this is going to do, it's going to check the string and tell you if it's empty or not. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look and see if the description is empty, and we're going to execute one action. And if the description is not empty, then we can execute a different action. So if the description is empty, we're going to put some more text out to the command line. This time I was thinking we might print a statement that says, you forgot to enter a glowing description of Jeffrey, because really that's what I'm after. And if they did enter a description, that is when we're going to print out the message about Jeffrey Booth. If you'll notice there's a little yellow squiggly line here, this just means that because we're already checking if this variable is null, we can remove that. So now let's test our application again and see what happens. All right, remember our bug before was that it's blank, so we're going to hit enter. You forgot to enter a glowing description of Jeffrey. That is great. It actually works now. Let's enter a compliment and make sure that functionality still works. It's always great to double test. Jeffrey Booth is handsome. That still works as well. Our program is really coming along. However, there's something that you've probably noticed. If we hit enter and apply a blank input, it gives us the message that says we forgot to enter a glowing description, but then guess what happens? Nothing. The application terminates. Wouldn't this program be much better if it kept prompting you and prompting you and prompting you until you entered valid input? That's what we're going to do next. So there's another logical structure in Dart called the do-while loop. Now this would be represented in English by saying something along the lines of, do run on treadmill while treadmill power is set to on. Now you would represent this in Dart in the following way. You're going to start with the keyword do, you're going to enter curly braces, and then at the end of this statement you're going to type out the keyword while, and then here is where your condition is going to go. So we're going to say do while description is empty. So we have our structure defined, but what do we want to happen inside of the do statement? If we're inside of this do statement, that means the description variable is empty. So what do we need to do in there? Well, I'll tell you, we need to collect the data again. So every time someone goes through that do loop, we want to check to make sure they have valid input. How can we do that? We're going to use the standard in readLineSync function. Now, if you notice, we've defined this here on line 6, but we don't actually want this to execute outside of our loop anymore. So we're going to remove everything to the right of the equals statement, and we're going to move that inside of the do loop, as so. We're going to type description, we're going to type equals, and then we're going to put that read, and then we're going to put that standard in dot readLineSync statement. Now you might notice another issue. A lot of the code that we have down below is now unnecessary. So we're actually going to take this if statement that we created below and we're going to delete it because the do while loop is taking care of all of the conditions that the if statement was addressing. But we are going to take this you forgot to enter a glowing description of Jeffrey code. We're going to move this print statement above where we're calling for the description so that the user is prompted to give input. And we're still going to leave this print statement down here to print out the description. So since this do while loop is executing on the very first time we load the application, we're also going to remove this standard out write statement at the very beginning of our application. So now let's test the application. So if you'll notice, it says you forgot to enter a glowing description of Jeffrey. Well, let's type something in. Let's type lazy. That's not glowing, but it still types out Jeffrey Booth is lazy. So there's two things here that are potential causes for concern. The first is you notice we're not being prompted on the same line as we were before. Well, that's actually because we're using the print statement instead of the standard out.write. So I wanted to showcase to you the difference between using print and standard out.write. If you use standard out.write, you have more control of the formatting. So let's type out standard out.write instead of print. And then we have our message. Now let's also change this message. We can't say you forgot because this is the first time they access the application. So instead of that, let's just change the wording to say, please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Now let's execute this again and see what happens. All right, we can see that we're on the correct line, and let's type out lazy. Jeffrey Booth is lazy. Great. But what functionality were we trying to fix? Let's test it out again, and let's enter a blank line. Oh, please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Ad nauseum. It will happen over and over and over and over, which is exactly the functionality we were looking for. But you're going to see a problem here. We could enter things like cool or awesome or lazy, anything you want, preferably positive. But do we really want to be able to put Jeffrey Booth is an exclamation point? Do we want to be able to put Jeffrey Booth is star, 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 star? No, we don't. So what we really need is a way to determine if this description variable is alphabetical or not. So we're going to do that using a function. Now, if you remember, when we created our original application, we used a function called main. Now, all a function is a piece of reusable code. Now, here's a couple of guidelines for functions. One of the first things you want to make sure to do is to have a function only serve one purpose and serve that purpose well. If you start combining 5 or 10 different things in a function, you're kind of defeating the purpose of using a function in the first place, and you're making your application needlessly convoluted and very hard to read. So we're going to create a very simple function here called isAlphabeticalOnly. Now, if you remember, the main function is of type void. That means it's not returning any data back. But if we're trying to determine if this is alphabetical or not, we actually need to define a data type with this function. Now, do you remember what data type is going to return true or false? I'll give you a second to answer that. If you didn't know, it's bool or boolean. So we're going to define a function of bool type instead of void, and we're going to call it isAlphabeticalOnly. Now here, this is where you can pass arguments to a function. Now you might be saying, what's an argument? Is it when your parents yell at each other and you go to your room and cry? No, it's not that. An argument is basically just data that you're passing into a function. So what do we need to figure out if the description only has alphabetical characters? Well, yeah, we need a string because a string is a sequence of characters. So we're going to define a string type in this argument. We're going to call this just str as an abbreviation for string. Now the reason we're going to do that is because perhaps we might want to use this function for things that aren't just the description, so we're going to use a more generic name for this function. Remember, functions need to be reusable. That's the whole purpose of them existing. So anything that occurs between these two curly braces is part of the isAlphabeticalOnly function. We're going to get into a concept here which I do not want you to concern yourself with. It's called a regular expression. It's way beyond the scope of this lesson. However, it is a way to check and see if characters are alphabetical only. So for the time being, don't worry why this works. If you want to, you can look up other tutorials or look at the Dart resources on regular expressions. All you really need to know about this regular expression is that it's checking if it has alphabetical characters only. And if it does, it is going to return true whenever you call this function. If it doesn't, it's going to return false. So now we have the function created, but how are we going to implement this in our application? Well, there's a couple ways that we can do so. The first thing we're going to do is we are going to create a new logical structure, a new if statement. And we're going to say if is alphabetical only, and then we're going to pass as an argument the name description. And then we're going to add curly braces. Now you're going to notice something that's happening here. We're getting an error on this name description. What's happening is it's just wanting us to do the null check here since we hadn't done it previously. So you're going to actually need to add the null check here, and then you can remove any subsequent references to the null check. Now there's something else here you're going to want to pay attention to. Let's think about this logically. Let's think about this in English. In this statement, what we're doing right now is we're saying if is alphabetical only description, then execute the following code. But we're not really trying to check if this is alphabetical. We're trying to check if this is not alphabetical. And that can actually be accomplished by doing something very simple. Now this is going to be slightly confusing because we're already using the exclamation point at the end of variables to check for null values. But what we're going to do at the start here is we're going to put an exclamation point. Now in the context of a Boolean operator, this basically just means the opposite. So we're checking if not is alphabetical only, or if is false. You could also write this statement as if is alphabetical only equals false, but you might as well take advantage of this little bit of syntactic sugar, which is what they call shortcuts like this, to make your statement shorter, easier to read. So now that we have this defined properly, what might we want to put inside of this if structure? The first thing we're going to want to do is return a different message if it has non-alphabetical characters. So we're going to use the standard out.write because, again, we want to format things properly. So standard out.write, and we're going to enter a different message here. I would say we should enter something like, please only enter alphabetical characters. And we're going to put a colon and then a space. And that's just for formatting. So one last thing we want to do before we test this application, we're going to need to move these two lines of code up before the if statement because we obviously need to collect the input before we check to see if it's alphabetical only or not. Now let's execute the application and see what happens. So it's giving us our prompt like normal. Please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Well, let's go ahead and enter a bunch of stars and see what happens. That's odd. It still returns Jeffrey Booth is star, 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 star. Well, we have a if statement here that's checking for that. Now, the reason this isn't working is we're not checking if it's alphabetical only in the do while loop. So while we have this if statement here that you can see, checking to see, it's not actually executing a second time. So we actually need to go down here to the do while loop and also run this check. Now, this is where we're going to get into a new type of logical operator, the or statement. Now, in English, you might say, if is an apple or an orange, then eat. But how do you write that out in code? Well, it's pretty simple. You're going to use these two vertical bars. They can be called vertical bars, slashes, or more common in programming, they're referred to as pipes. That is synonymous with the word or when you're working in code. So we can say while description is empty or is alphabetical only. And then remember, we have to put the exclamation point to the front to say is not alphabetical only. Let's run the code again and see what happens. Describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Let's do exclamation point. See, it's asking us again, please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Exclamation point, exclamation point. Great, now let's enter a letter, J. That also works. If you'll notice, it gave us this statement, please only enter alphabetical characters when we entered the proper input. That literally makes no sense. Well, if you're gonna look up here at the if statement, it's because we did not have the exclamation point on the if statement. So we didn't basically reverse that Boolean value. Let's try it one more time. Dart lesson 1. Please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Exclamation point. Please only enter alphabetical characters. Please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Ooh, this is a new error. Why do you guys think this is happening? Take a look at the code. Now you're going to notice that every single time we run the do while loop, we're actually calling the standard out.write message. Now, my assumption is, and I would assume this is your assumption as well, that we only want that to execute on the first try. So how can we accomplish that? So the easiest way to accomplish that is to take this statement and move it outside of the do while loop. So it will only execute the first time the application is run. Now let's try this again and see if this resolved our issue. Exclamation point. Please only enter alphabetical characters. Now let's enter Jeffrey Booth is cool. That works properly. So it looks like we've resolved the issue where users can enter non-standard alphabetical characters. However, I'm sure you've noticed there's some other issues with the design of this application. For instance, let's run it again. Now I could type in Jeffrey Booth, describe Jeffrey Booth in one word, and I could enter the letter A. That's not very useful. Jeffrey Booth is A. Let's try it again. Please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Jeffrey Booth is JJ. That's not very useful either. So I can see a small problem here. we really don't need to allow less than 3 characters. I can't think of any descriptive words of 2 characters or 1 character, so let's go ahead and set that limitation, but you might be wondering, how do you do that? Now, fortunately, because Dart is such a full-featured language, it's actually extremely easy to do this. Now, if you remember, a string is just a sequence of characters, and Dart has a built-in function called length that you can use on any string as follows. You're going to have to go to our if statement here. You're going to have to do the or logical operator or logical statement. And remember, you're going to use the pipes or vertical slashes to represent or. And then you'll be able to type our variable description, dot. And when you do a dot after the end of a variable or an object, it's going to allow you to use methods that are attached to that object. So a method is a function that's attached to a particular object. You don't need to worry too much about what that means now, but just understand that is the difference between a function and a method. There is a method built in called .length, which is going to return an integer value of how many characters are in that string. So we've got description.length, we're going to say is less than 3. We want to repeat this statement. Now, if you remember, we also had to add this to the while statement. So we're also going to use or. We're also going to do description.length is less than 3 on the do while loop as well. Let's run the program and see what happens. So we're going to enter A. Please only enter alphabetical characters. Oh, I see the problem here. Now the problem here is that we're not checking to see if the description is less than 3 in a different place. So we're checking to see if it's alphabetical only or if the description is less than 3 and returning the same message. So we're going to introduce another basic building block of programming called the else if statement. You can basically attach this to any if statement in Dart. And if that if statement is not met, it will move on to the else if statement. This is really great if you want to make a lot of comparisons on a single piece of data and have different actions occur. So you're going to type out else if. And then you're going to type out what you're looking for. So in this case, we're going to look for a description whose length is less than 3. We're going to type out our curly braces, and then we're going to make a new message with standard out.write. We're going to output to the command line, please enter a word of 3 characters or more. Let's test and see if this worked. Let's type out A. Please only enter alphabetical characters. The error still happened again. Why do you think that is? Well, it's simply because we forgot to remove this check to see if description.length is less than 3. So let's try it again. Let's enter A. Please enter a word of 3 characters or more. Let's enter AA. Please enter a word of 3 characters or more. And let's enter cool. We get the desired output of Jeffrey Booth is cool. So you can see how useful an else if statement could be. You could basically have an infinite list of criteria that specifies different messages based on that criteria. So let's identify another very serious flaw in this software design. Let's run our application. Please describe Jeffrey Booth in 1 word. Well, if I were a not so kindly inclined individual, I might put in a statement like, Jeffrey Booth is stupid. Now the output that we're going to get from that statement is Jeffrey Booth is stupid. We do not want this. I, as Jeffrey Booth, have no interest in saying derogatory statements of my plainly amazing character. So how do we stop this from happening? How do we stop these bad actors from accessing our application? Well, I would say we would probably want a list of words that we are going to prohibit. Now, do you remember earlier in the video where we talked about what a list is? A list is just an ordered sequence of data. It sounds like something we could definitely use in this scenario. So we're going to use a list to store all the negative words that we don't want to allow. However, because I want to design this application intelligently and make it easy to read and scalable, I think we should define a new function. So let's define a function. Let's make it a bool again because we just want to return true or false, and we're going to call it is this mean? And once again, we're going to pass in a string called str, and then we're going to put our curly braces. Now, I think inside of this is this mean statement, we should create our list. So I'm going to copy and paste this so you don't have to watch me type this over and over. It's a list of strings called prohibited words. And you'll see the words we put in here are stupid, dumb, brainless, ugly, short, weak, foolish, and smelly. So these are the words we're not going to allow our users to input. But you're going to notice a couple things. First, we're getting an error on the is this mean function. Now the reason we're getting this error is because we're not yet returning a true or false statement. We're not going to worry about solving this. This error is actually going to solve itself as we return the proper data. Now, if you remember, earlier we said description, which is a string object, has certain methods attached with it. And one of those was the length method. Well, it turns out list also has methods attached with it. So every list has a method called contains. So we're going to hit period, and then we're going to call contains, the method contains, and we're going to pass it the string that we've named str. Great, you can see there's no errors generated here. However, what we need to do is understand that this contains method is going to once again return a Boolean value or a true or false statement. So we can actually return this piece of code, and it's going to give us a true or false statement for is this mean. So if someone enters one of these prohibited words, we'll get true. If they don't, it's going to be false. So we're going to go back up. Now, can you remember how to use the else if statement? If so, I'd like you to pause and kind of architect in your mind or in your code editor how we could add an else if statement here to check and see if something is mean. If you don't remember how, you can just follow along with me now. We're going to enter else if, and then in our logical operator, we're going to do is this mean. We're going to pass in our description, and then we're going to place our curly braces here to execute any code that we want to take place if is this mean is true. And in this case, we do want it to actually happen if it's true, so we do not need to add that exclamation point to the front of the function. So if this is mean, what should we write? I think we should write, please write something nice or nothing at all. Now I'm going to save you the time and remind you of this one more time. We also need to run this check as part of the do while loop. So again, we're going to put the vertical bars or pipes, and then we're going to say, is this mean description? All right, let's go ahead and test this application and see if it works. Please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Stupid. Please write something nice or nothing at all. All right, well, let's try it again. Ugly. Please write something nice or nothing at all. It's functioning as proper. Let's try to type in something nice. Let's say Jeffrey Booth is a genius amongst men. Please only enter alphabetical characters. You know why it's doing that? Because we filtered out spaces. So you actually are forced to enter one word. So let's try one word, genius. Jeffrey Booth is genius. This is amazing. It's actually working as we expect. We now have an application, a very useful application, that will prompt you for a compliment on Jeffrey Booth. And if you enter something short or invalid or mean, it's going to force you to enter a valid response, which of course is something kind and glowing. But you know what? I can see another problem with this code. So right now, people can enter something negative, and there's a small message. That's all they get. There's no consequence. So what I'd like to do now is when a user enters something that's mean, I would like to make them think there's going to be a consequence. I would like them to think that perhaps the FBI or the police are going to show up at their doorstep, perhaps arrest them, or throw them in solitary confinement for the rest of their days. Sounds good. So how do we do that? Well, as you're probably going to guess, we're going to create a new function. I'm going to make this function of type void, and you'll see why in a moment. And we're going to call this alert authorities. And I'd like you to notice something as I'm creating this alert authorities function. More often than not, in modern programming languages, and this is the case with Dart, they like you to use what's called camel case, which basically means if you're creating a method or a function that has more than one word in it, you leave the first letter lowercase, and after that, any word will have an uppercase letter. This isn't that important, but it makes it easier to read code when everyone who develops for certain languages names their variables the same way. There are certain instances where you would not use camel case, but those are reserved for different types of operations that we're not worrying about today. I just thought I would point that out in case you were wondering why I was naming the function that way. So what are we going to do inside of alert authorities? Well, right now I think we're just going to print a statement. Let's print a statement that says, you have entered something extremely unkind. The FBI, CIA, and local police have been alerted. Great. So we have a function that just prints that statement out on the command line. Now, what should we do with this function? Well, we're not comparing it to anything, so we don't need to worry about all these if statements. We don't need to add anything to the do while loop. But what we do need to do is find where we're checking to see if this is mean. So you can see this on line 14. If is this mean, we are going to call the function alert authorities. Now, since this is type void, all we need to do is type out the function name. We don't need to worry about passing it a variable. We don't need to worry about defining a data type, none of that. So let's try this application. Let's see if it works. Please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. I think we're going to call him ugly because he is. Oh no. You have entered something extremely unkind. The FBI, CIA, and local police have been alerted. Please write something nice or nothing at all. Oh God, we best write tall. Not true. Okay, Jeffrey Booth is tall. Great. So it seems like we averted catastrophe. That's fantastic. But you know what I think? I think if you're watching this channel or using this application, you're probably on the higher end of the IQ spectrum. And that means you are not going to fall for this message. How could we make this message more convincing? I think I know a way we can make this message more convincing. Let's add what we would call a bit of very basic animation to it so that it appears as if the message is being sent to the FBI, CIA, and local police in real time. So we're going to make a few changes here. The first is we're going to go to our void alert authorities function, and instead of just doing a print statement, we're actually going to make a string called alert message, and we're going to put our message here. The reason we're going to do this here is because we're going to reuse this data with some other functions, and that won't be possible if it's simply put in a print statement. Now there's another piece of data that we're going to need. Now don't worry if it doesn't make sense to you why we need this data now. Just suffice to say we are going to need it. So we need to know how many characters are in the alert message. Remember, there's a function that goes along with any variable that's defined as a string called length. That allows you to get an integer of how many characters are in any string. But if we just call it in this way, it's not going to be useful. We actually need to create a new variable. Let's call this int number of characters equals alert message.length. Now, why are we creating a new variable instead of just calling alert message.length wherever we want? Well, it's just to make the code more readable. There's no answer besides that. You can actually do it either way. This is a design and architecture decision. I envision this application typing out each letter of the string or the alert message we defined earlier individually, so it has an appearance of real-time connection. So how can we go through and access each individual character of a string? Well, there's a few things we need to do first. One is we're going to introduce a new piece of programming logic called the for loop. Now, I want you to understand that the first time you see a for loop, it's probably not going to make sense. It's probably going to take 10, 20, maybe even 30 repetitions before you actually understand and can internalize and use these at will. For now, just accept the explanation, take notes if you need to, and practice it on your own. Trust me, this will come with time. So we define a for loop in the following way. We're going to use the expression for. We're going to create our curly braces here, and then we're going to come back, and we have to define three separate statements here. We're going to define first an int called I, and we're going to set that equals to 0. What that means is where does this loop start? Because the purpose of a for loop is to iterate through something X amount of times. And so you can choose a different starting number. We're going to start at 0 because that's where computers start counting at 0 and not 1. And then the next is the comparison operator. So this is going to be saying execute this loop while the following is true. So we're going to execute this loop while the integer I is less than the number of characters. So this for loop is going to run as many times as there are characters in our alert message. And then the third component of the for loop is what you do each time the for loop executes. So we're going to put I++, which is shorthand or syntactic sugar to say I equals I plus 1. So let's run a quick test here. We're just going to print I each time it goes through this loop so that we can see if this is running as we expect and so we can see how many characters are present. Please describe Jeffrey Booth in one word. Stupid. So you can see it executed through this loop 90 plus times. 92 times to be exact. So that means there's 92 characters, and that means our for loop is working properly. So now we have to figure, how do we take each character out of our string? Well, as you're probably expecting, we're going to use the alert message variable, which is a string object, and we're going to use a method that's attached with all strings called substring. As you can probably surmise from the name, the substring method allows you to take a subsection of that string and output it and use it however you see fit. So with substring, we want to start returning data on the variable integer I, which means, as you might remember, the very first entry in our string. And then we want the end of that data to be I plus 1 because we only want to get one character at a time. So we put our semicolon here, and now we're going to run the program again and see what we get. Jeffrey Booth is ugly. Please write something nice or not at all. Jeffrey Booth is stupid. That's interesting. We're not getting any output at all. Oh, well, you can see that's because we're not printing anything. We just ran the substring function, but we didn't do anything with it. So let's run a print statement. And then let's try it again. Jeffrey Booth is stupid. All right, now you can notice it's actually printing out every letter individually. Now, why does this look so awful? Well, I'm going to tell you the reason is because we're using the print statement, which automatically formats it by adding a line break after the end of every character. So instead, let's try switching to the method that you might remember, standardout.write, and see if that resolves our issue. Jeffrey Booth is stupid. There you go, you can see it. You have entered something extremely unkind. The FBI, CIA, and local police have been alerted. Please write something nice or nothing at all. Jeffrey Booth is cool. All right. So there's one thing remaining that we have to take care of here. We have to make sure all of those letters write out individually. Now that's a little more complicated, but trust me, we can handle it. Now the first thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to change the data type of alert authorities from void to a future. The shortest description of a future that I can give is that a future means it's data that's going to be returned at a later time. Now, as you can see, this is returning an error for us now. The error is that we're not returning a future of type dynamic. So how do we return a future? Well, let's look. Right now with standardout.write, we're just printing a message to the console. But we don't just want to print the message to the console. We want to wait a specified amount of time to do so. So Dart has what's called asynchronous computing functionality built into it, which means that you can call a function or call for a piece of data or call a remote API, and you can choose either to wait for that data to return, or you can choose to allow for it to happen independently. There's times where you don't want your application to continue until you've executed the function or obtained data, and there's times where multiple things can happen simultaneously. In this case, we want to wait because we want all these characters to write out individually. So we're going to use a keyword called await. Now you're going to notice an error here. That's because we haven't defined this function as asynchronous. So we just have to add async there before the curly braces. So we're going to run future.delayed, and then we're going to pass it an argument. Now this argument is going to be a new object in Dart that we haven't used before called a duration. A duration is just a way to pass an increment of time to Dart. So we're going to pass a duration, and notice you can select days, hours, microseconds, milliseconds, minutes, or seconds. We're going to start this out by just doing 50 milliseconds and see if that's enough. And then after duration, but still part of that argument, we're going to pass in a new function. This might be a little confusing to read, but just know that whatever happens inside of the curly braces is going to execute every 50 milliseconds for the duration of the for loop. You might be thinking all we need to do is copy this standardout.write statement and put it inside of this future statement, and you would actually be correct. Now let's check and see if we have any error messages. It doesn't look like it. Let's see if this application will execute and if we get the expected output. So we're going to type out Jeffrey Booth is stupid. Please write something nice or not at all. Huh, that's interesting. It didn't actually work at all. We need to troubleshoot this and figure out what the problem is. Well, look at that. It's all typing in after I entered something nice. This doesn't really make any sense. We need to figure out what's going on here. Let's scroll up and troubleshoot where we're calling alert authorities. I don't know if you remember what I said earlier, but sometimes with asynchronous computing, you really want to make sure that the application waits for that function or data to return before it executes. I bet we just need to do that with the alert authority statement. So what we're going to do is we're going to add that await keyword in front of the function. Now it's giving us an error. Let's see what that says. The await expression can only be used in an async function. That's right. We actually defined this function down here, alert authorities, as async, but we never defined our main function as async, so let's go ahead and do so. Let's try to execute our application again and see what happens. Jeffrey Booth is stupid. You have entered something extremely unkind. The FBI, CIA, and local police have been alerted. Please write something nice or not at all. So let's write nice. Okay, that's great. Now I notice a couple issues here. I think we could change this statement to write something a little bit more pushy to get them to write a compliment. Please write something nice before the authorities arrive. Let's try that again and see if it works. Jeffrey Booth is ugly. You can see the statement appearing properly. Good. Everything's working as expected so far. Please write something nice before the authorities arrive. Let's write cool. Jeffrey Booth is cool. Okay, the application has ended. Everything worked. So there's one final thing we can do to format this message and make it look a little nicer. At the end of our alert message, we're going to type /n. This is basically just shorthand for line break that you can use inside of strings, especially when you're dealing with something like a command line interface or a terminal. Let's try it one more time and see how this worked. Jeffrey Booth is ugly. Let's see how everything works. Please write something nice before the authorities arrive. Oh God, Jeffrey Booth is kind. Jeffrey Booth is kind. It worked. So I want to thank you all for watching this video, and I want to stress that even though we used a cheeky, hilarious example, you have just been exposed to core principles of Dart that are going to allow you to write many applications of your own. Some of them more simplistic than this one, and some much more complicated. Because when you really break programming down to it, all it is a series of statements deciding what happens and when. And so when you can start understanding very basic structures like if, else, or if, else, if, else, or for loops, do, while loops, you can make a lot of programs. So you understand the data types, you understand basic logical structures and loops, you understand how to use methods associated with the built-in Dart data types, and you even understand how to get input from the command line. You can go on and use these skills in basically an infinite amount of ways. So I want to thank you so much for staying tuned through this video. I want to thank you for humoring me with my hilarious examples of code. And I want to encourage you to jump onto the next Dart video where we're going to be talking about one of the more core components of Dart, the fact that it is an object-oriented programming language. You're going to want to know what that means and how that works, and we're going to break it down in the simplest way possible. So until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. Don't forget to leave a comment or thumbs up. Bye.